Hello, class. So today we're going to be focusing on understanding colonization. And you had a reading that I really want us to talk about and focus on because I think it encapsulates this section for this week very well. Just a brief update on the course. All the grades have been updated. All the midterm exams have been graded and updated. All the extra credit has been graded and updated. So I'm very on track with the grading system. So the grade that you have right now, if the semester were to end tomorrow, that would be your final grade. So if you have any concerns about your grade, any questions, any issues going on with your assignment submission, excuse me, please contact me right away so that we can work something out. I really want to make sure that everybody in the class is able to pass and finish the semester successfully. So let's get right into this week's lecture. In the essay by Deborah Miranda, Extermination of the Hoyas, Gendercide in Spanish California, we learned a lot about the different colonial periods of Spanish California in the early 1800s. And what we're going to be doing today is talking about the main critical points that this author is speaking to and how this all relates to the study of gender studies and our introductory course on women's studies. So let's get started. First of all, we need to think about and define what gendercide means. And this is very specific to the article. The systemic killing of members of a specific gender is how gendercide is often defined. And in the article that you read, Deborah Miranda actually included a poem that I want us to read. I have it in my mind that dykes are Indians. They're a lot like Indians. They were massacred lots of times. They always came back, like the gas, like the clouds. They got massacred again. This poem is helpful for us to start to think through this essay because it connects the violence of colonialism with gender. And this is why we're going to be reading this essay. Often when we learn about colonial violence, imperial violence, we very hardly engage with the way that that violence was meant to solidify gender categories, gender in the way that gender became naturalized, that certain categories, certain binary categories became naturalized and were seen as the hegemonic dominant form where nothing else was possible. But we're actually going to learn about the history of Spanish California and how the indigenous communities there were doing critical work in their society by integrating what were often referred to as two-spirit, gender fluid people into their social structure, and not just integrated, but had a critical role in society. So we're going to learn about that today. My apologies for this. One of the things that Deborah Miranda talks about is she refers to the violence of the archive. She says that using non-Indian archives to tell an Indian story are incredibly flawed because of the biases, the political agendas, and the cultural pride that was taking place at the time. So this is a big thing that we've seen through a lot of different studies that we've engaged with at the beginning and at the end of the semester. We'll be talking about this. One of the key figures that comes to mind is the work of Saidiya Hartman, as well as a recent publication that happened a few years ago from a scholar at Rutgers. Her name is Marisa Fuentes, who's published a book on called Dispossessed Lives that engages with the archive of slavery to better understand the people and the decisions that were taking place at the time. One of the things that she's very critical about, the author Marisa Fuentes, is how the archive recreates the violence of slavery in contemporary times. And this is a pertinent argument in Deborah Miranda's essay as well. She says that when we look at non-Indian archives and we look at the the briefs, the insurance documents, the letters that were left by colonial structures and systems, we get a very, very limited picture of what was going on at that time and a biased picture about the racial purification processes that were happening, the gender violence that was happening, the immediate changes in society structure. All of that, it's hard to read through the archive. As long as we focus on understanding these time periods through a non-Indian archive, we will be dealing with a lot of biases, is what Deborah Miranda is arguing. She says that these archives constantly have to be questioned because we don't know the information about who collected the information, what were their motives, who preserved the information, and what were their motives. The use of a passive voice is also pertinent in these types of archives where we don't get an understanding about the people who engaged in the violence. In other words, there's descriptions about what happened, but there's not a conscious claim of who did this, who decided this, and there's a lot of things that are left behind from these archives. She says that learning how to reread as a mixed blood California Indian lesbian poet was an essential part to her methodology. One of the terms that she's working with in this essay is this notion of a Hoya, the Hoya. She says that this name was actually created by the Spanish and is a Spanish name for third gender people. It examines methods employed by the Spaniards to exterminate the Hoya. In other words, by reading the archive, the author was able to determine how Spanish colonial systems were engaging in violence to eradicate and completely destroy this community of genderqueer two-spirit people at the time. She asks what the extermination meant to California Indian cultures. So, in other words, when this large population of people were exterminated, what happened to the rest of the cultural systems that were happening or taking place at that time? She explores the survival of this third gender through first understanding the terminology of Hoya and then moving to Joto, which is a different term to refer to somebody who is queer. She evaluates the emergence of spiritual and physical renewal of the ancestral third gender in California Indian two-spirit individuals. And this is both a personal story and a historical struggle about identity played out in many indigenous communities all over the world. And I would argue that it's also really questioning the methodologies that we employ in the study in the field of history and the way that we engage with archival work and what the archive does and its limitations. For Deborah Miranda, third gender peer people are what were defined by the Spanish as the Hoya. And she makes a very critical point argument here. This is probably the main thesis point as well as the stakes of her piece. She says that third gender people were exterminated not by passive extermination, which we commonly hear as diseases that were passed down by blankets, starvation, right? We hear all these common tropes about what colonial violence looked like at that time. But she says we need to think about it wasn't just passive means of giving blankets that carry disease or letting people starve. It was also a violent, conscious extermination. But why don't we hear about these narratives? And I want you to think about this in your responses for this week. Why don't we hear about these narratives? Why are the common rhetorics about colonial violence centered around passivity, right? That colonial violence had a small and passive role to play. But what Deborah Miranda is showing us is that it was a very violent, conscious extermination. She says that soldiers and priests colonizing Mexico and what would become California arrived with a deep abhorrence of what they viewed as homosexual relationships. And this is apparent in soldiers' memoirs from 1775 that describe their aversion to queerness and homosexuality at the time period. She says that this is a critical part to distinguish between encounter and destruction. A lot of times when we hear the histories of colonial violence, we hear Christopher Columbus arrived to the New Americas, or the Spanish arrived, or there was an encounter. But she says that this language is completely false and problematic and misleading because it wasn't about an encounter, it was about immediate extermination and destruction. I include this image here from the reading, and it's a figure two from an archive by Frankfurt de Bry and Sowry from 1598. It states, Theodore de Bry, quote, Balboa throws the Indians who have committed the abominable crime of sodomy to be torn to bits by dogs, end quote. This is an engraving from Bartolomé de las Casas, Narratio Regonium Indicarum per Hispanos. This is in Latin. And this is a visual representation of the type of extermination that was taking place at this time. And I ask that you, if you need to not look at this image or take some time away from it, please do so, and go ahead and just listen to the audio that I'm describing. But I really wanted to include it on here because a lot of times when we talk about colonialism and the violence of slavery and why it all relates to contemporary times, it's critical to understand and look at these violent, horrendous acts of extermination that were taking place during these colonial periods. That it wasn't just an encounter or a passive role that colonial forces played. But Deborah Miranda makes it very clear that it was a critical, consciously violent role. She says that killing the Hoyas, by the time the Spaniards had expanded their territory to California, the use of dogs as weapons to kill or eat Indians, particularly Hoyas, was well established. And that this violence against Hoya's classic homophobia, she asks why it's so critical to define it as gendercide. And I want you to answer this in your responses if you have time. Why is this distinction between colonial violence and gendercide so critical? The origins of Hoyas and the oppression of naming is very clear in her argument as well. She says that the violence that happened in the 1700s was one part of the violence, and that now we're moving towards this epistemological violence. And what I mean by epistemological is the type of violence that impacts what we know and how knowledge is produced. And she says that the origins of the Hoyas, that this violence, epistemological violence, continued. She says, although Spanish morality disapproved of sodomy, quote unquote sodomy, within their own culture and had a collection of words and euphemisms available to describe, quote unquote, el acto pecado nefando, the silent unspoken sin, they did not choose to apply these existing Spanish labels to California Indians. Instead, they came up with a new term, the Hoya. And multiple possibilities for the origin of this word exist. However, it was not meant to be a compliment, but oddly enough, it does reflect the respect with which pre-contact California natives regarded this gender. So originally, the Spanish named the third gender people of the Society of Spanish California before Spanish California as the Hoya. And it wasn't meant to be an uplifting term, but in Spanish, if you know, Hoya translates to jewel or a precious gem or a precious stone. And this is where Deborah Miranda finds it peculiar that, oddly enough, this term was used also reflected respect within pre-contact California late natives before this contact of violence, and how it was regarded in terms of their gender. One of the key things that I liked about this essay is that it's very explicit and helping us understand how punishment was an act, how acts of punishment were exactly aligned with regendering and shame. And what do I mean when I say regendering? The Hoyas were made to dress as men, act as men, and consort with men in contexts for which they had little, if any, experience. So this was an immediate shift in their social structure. Hoyas before had a critical role in the caretaking of the dead and in the spiritual and religious work of the society. After the Spanish arrived and engaged in horrible violence and grotesque punishment, they played a critical role in reorganizing society and forcing Hoyas, who had originally this very unique and special role in society, to be part of the sphere of men in the world. And this was a very it was a completely new shift. They did not know how to dress within this gender category. They did not know how to consort with people in this gender category, and they had little, if any, experience in being within this group of people. On page 266, Deborah Miranda states, as a consequence of this regendering, renaming, and murder, one of the Hoya's most important responsibilities, on which the well-being of the tribe depended, was completely disrupted. Prohibited by the priest, the complex and deeply spiritual position of undertaker became a masterful example of colonization by appropriation. So I really want you to sit with that and understand what this quote is saying. Regendering happened and renaming happened, and the murder of the roles that used to be played by Hoya people and Two-Spirit people no longer continued. And this was a critical role that they played in society before. Caretaking of the dead, managing what we would understand now as funerals, all of that was a critical part of the Hoyas. And after Spanish colonization, this immediate regendering and reorganization of the structure happened. Two-spirited peoples, which include Indigenous California third gender people, are re-emerging from attempted gendercide. So this is part of her argument here. Deborah Miranda says, this classification of people is coming back. That what we survived by performing a division between spiritual and sexual roles in our communities. So she said that even though there was this grotesque, horrendous violence, that people who identify as third gender continue to show up and survive, even though there was this immediate regendering and division between spiritual and sexual roles in the communities. They reemerge as contemporary two-spirit people, a reunion of spiritual and sexual roles into a whole and undivided gender role, a role still needed in human society, one that nurtures our communities and continues to play a critical role in maintaining community and taking care of the spiritual workings of society. She says that the argument here is that the descendants of Hoyas are two-spirit people in contemporary California now. So I want you to think about this for your response and for your essay as you're working on this reading response for this week. How are you thinking through this analysis of gender queerness and how it relates to gendercide and the violence of colonization? A lot of times when you learn about colonialism and colonization, do you learn about the ways that gender played a critical role in this, and particularly the way that gender queerness and the existence of two-spirit, Hoya, or other indigenous communities of queerness and fluidity and gender fluidity. Have you learned about this before? Is this the first time you're learning about it? Please share what your thoughts are. So we're at week 12, and as you can see, the readings and the workload is minimizing because we're really getting to the end of the semester. But for this week, I want you to really focus on the extermination of the Hoyas piece, the law enforcement violence against women of color essay by, what is the name of the author who wrote this piece? Andrea Ritchie is an exceptional piece. Andrea Ritchie continues to do amazing work currently, and she is constantly coming up with new theories and new works and writing about how her work from the 60s, 70s, and 80s relates to contemporary movements now. So I want you to focus on that. You have a writing response due as always on Friday at 5 p.m. And that's all that I have for you today. So thank you so much. If you